In the humid, tense summer of 1944, following the massive Allied landings in Normandy, the hedgerows and rolling fields of France became a brutal testing ground for men and machines. For the American and Commonwealth tank crews pushing inland in their ubiquitous M4 Shermans, the mood was one of grim confidence. They were numerous, well-supplied, and backed by overwhelming air power. The German tanks they had encountered so far, mostly Panzer IVs and various assault guns, were dangerous opponents but familiar threats. Rumors of a new, heavier German tank, sleek and predatory, circulated among the troops, but they were often dismissed with the characteristic bravado of seasoned soldiers. In the turrets of their Shermans, many crews joked about the new German menagerie, confident that whatever the Wehrmacht threw at them, their numbers and proven tactics would prevail. This initial lightheartedness, however, was about to be shattered by a harsh, metallic clang, the sound of a 75mm shell harmlessly ricocheting off the sloped armor of a Panther. The first significant introduction to this new predator came not in a head-on duel but in a shocking ambush that highlighted the deadly effectiveness of the new German tank when properly employed. On the foggy morning of June 9, 1944, near the village of Bretteville-Orgueilius, a column of Panthers from the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, rolled forward to counterattack the advancing Canadian forces. Many of the young SS tankers, some of whom had never seen real combat, were filled with ideological fervor and an unshakable belief in the superiority of their machines. Inside the steel hulls of their brand-new PzKpfw V Panthers, jokes were likely made at the expense of the Allied tin cans they were about to engage. They were the hunters, the apex predators of the battlefield, and this was to be their proving ground. What happened next was a brutal lesson in armored warfare. Concealed in well-chosen positions were Canadian Sherman Fireflies, a British modification of the standard Sherman equipped with a formidable 17-pounder high-velocity cannon. As the Panthers confidently advanced, the Fireflies opened fire. The powerful guns, specifically designed to defeat thick German armor, tore through the Panthers with devastating effect. Within minutes, the seemingly invincible German assault ground to a halt. 7 of the formidable steel cats were transformed into burning pyres, their ammunition cooking off in catastrophic explosions. The surviving German crews bailed out in horror and confusion, scrambling for cover, utterly baffled as to who, or what, had hit them. Their initial arrogance had evaporated in a wave of fire and shrapnel. The psychological impact on the elite Hitlerjugend division was immediate and profound. The German company commander, an officer named Ludemann, suffered a complete nervous breakdown in the aftermath of the battle and had to be evacuated to a hospital. His collapse was a testament to the sheer shock of the encounter. One of his fellow officers, recalling the event years after the war, captured the sentiment of utter despair that gripped them. "I could have cried with rage and grief then." The myth of the Panther's invincibility had been shattered on its very first major outing. This engagement served as a stark warning: while the new German tank was formidable, it was not unbeatable. For the Allies, it was a crucial, if sobering, victory. For the Germans, it was a bitter and humiliating introduction to a weapon that could meet their prized cat on equal terms. The laughter in the Sherman turrets may have faded, replaced by a grim respect, but the legend of the Panther, and the fear it would inspire, was just beginning. The grim reality that confronted Allied tankers after their initial, bloody encounters with the Panther was not a matter of German fighting spirit or tactical genius alone, it was a stark lesson in the cold, unforgiving physics of armored warfare. The initial confidence, and even laughter, of the Sherman crews died in the face of a simple, brutal equation: their primary weapon was often incapable of defeating Germany's new medium tank in a head-on engagement. The reason for this terrifying disparity lay in a revolutionary design philosophy that prioritized frontal protection above all else, creating a steel beast that seemed to mock the standard Allied anti-tank munitions. The secret to the Panther's survivability was twofold: thick plating combined with extreme sloping. Its frontal hull armor, known as the glacis plate, was 80mm thick, while the turret front boasted an even more substantial 100mm of high-quality steel. While these figures were impressive on their own, the true genius of the design was the radical 55-degree angle at which this armor was sloped. This simple geometric principle had a profound effect on its defensive capabilities. Firstly, the steep angle dramatically increased the chance that an incoming shell would simply deflect, or bounce, harmlessly off the surface without detonating. Secondly, for a shell that did manage to bite into the plate, it had to travel through a much greater effective thickness of steel. A projectile striking the 80mm glacis plate at a 55-degree angle had to penetrate a line of sight equivalent of approximately 140mm of armor. In some areas, this effective protection could reach as high as 180mm, a level of defense previously associated only with heavy tanks. The Panther, in essence, presented a frontal aspect that was virtually impenetrable to the weapons mounted on the vast majority of Allied tanks in the summer of 1944. Against this rolling fortress, the standard American M4 Sherman was woefully outgunned. Its main armament, the 75mm M3 gun, was a versatile and reliable weapon that had proven effective against earlier German designs and was excellent for firing high-explosive shells in support of infantry. However, against the Panther's frontal plate, its armor-piercing capabilities were tragically insufficient. Ballistic data confirmed what crews were discovering through lethal experience. The 75mm gun could penetrate a maximum of 76mm of vertical armor at a range of 500 meters. When faced with the Panther's 140mm plus of effective frontal armor, the Sherman's shell simply had no chance. It was a mathematical certainty of failure. Even the upgraded 76mm high-velocity gun, introduced to later Sherman models specifically to counter the new generation of German armor, could not reliably defeat the Panther's glacis. While it offered a significant improvement and could penetrate the turret front or the thinner side armor, a direct, frontal confrontation remained a suicidal proposition. This technical impotence gave rise to a sense of fatalism and gallows humor among the American crews. A popular, albeit apocryphal, tale began to circulate through the tank battalions, a piece of wartime folklore that perfectly encapsulated their frustration. The story went that the Sherman's shells would ricochet off a Panther's sloped armor with such incredible force that, if fired from close range, they could bounce back and hit the very tank that fired them. While physically improbable, the myth served as a potent metaphor for the feeling of utter helplessness in the face of the German machine. It was a way of articulating a terrifying truth: their best weapon was not only ineffective, it was laughably so. However, the Panther's armor was not as infallible as it appeared on paper. A little-known fact, often overlooked in post-war analyses, was the significant degradation in the quality of German steel as the conflict wore on. Constant Allied bombing of industrial centers and growing shortages of critical alloying elements like molybdenum meant that the metallurgical integrity of the armor plates could vary dramatically. Even Panthers produced as early as 1943 were known to suffer from these problems. This resulted in armor that, while meeting thickness specifications, could be overly brittle. Instead of absorbing or deflecting a hit, a compromised plate might shatter or spall, sending deadly fragments of steel flying around the interior of the tank even without a full penetration. This inconsistency added a terrifying element of randomness to every duel. An Allied gunner might see 5 of his shells bounce harmlessly off a Panther's glacis, only for the 6th to strike a poorly manufactured section and cause a catastrophic failure. The Panther's armor was theoretically superior, but in practice, it carried a hidden, and often fatal, flaw. The transformation in the mindset of an American Sherman crew upon encountering a Panther was swift and brutal. It was a psychological journey that began with the confident, often dismissive humor of a well-equipped army and ended in a state of primal fear, tempered only by grim determination. The laughter that had echoed in the steel confines of Sherman turrets during the early days of the Normandy campaign quickly died out, replaced by the chilling silence of crews who had witnessed firsthand the futility of their 75mm guns against the German Predator. This evolution from arrogance to awe, and finally to a kind of superstitious dread, was not born of cowardice but of a rational and terrifying understanding of the technical mismatch they faced. The raw, visceral shock of a non-penetrating hit was a feeling seared into the memory of every tanker who experienced it. One American crewman vividly recalled the moment his world was turned upside down by a Panther's 75mm shell. The machine shuddered from a powerful impact. The second enemy shell ended up on my lap. It was so hot that it burned my gloves. This single, terrifying account encapsulates the entire psychological shift. The experience was not just one of being shot at, it was a profound violation of the perceived safety of their armored cocoon. The enemy's projectile didn't just dent the outside, it physically entered the crew compartment, a burning, metallic harbinger of death that had contemptuously shrugged off their tank's armor. For that crewman, the Panther was no longer an abstract threat or a piece of enemy hardware. It was a monster whose fiery breath could reach inside his sanctuary, a force that operated on a different level of lethality. Such events, repeated across the battlefields of France, stripped away the bravado and replaced it with a heavy, palpable fear. This dread was compounded by the tactics employed by the German tank commanders. The Allied crews quickly learned that they were not just fighting a superior machine, but often a cunning and experienced adversary. Frequently, the Germans resorted to tricks, one veteran remembered, describing how Panthers would use the terrain to their advantage, lying in wait in perfectly camouflaged ambush positions, holding their fire until the Shermans were at point-blank range where escape was impossible. This created an atmosphere of intense paranoia. Every tree lean, every darkened barn, every rise in the road could conceal a Panther. The psychological strain of advancing through the claustrophobic Normandy hedgerows, knowing that a single, unseen enemy could wipe out an entire platoon in minutes, was immense. The fear was not just of the tank itself, but of the unseen, patient hunter operating it. In the face of this overwhelming technological and tactical challenge, American soldiers did what they have always done: they resorted to gallows humor. A dark joke began to make the rounds, one that perfectly captured the blend of fear and fatalistic resolve that defined the tanker's experience. The anecdote told of a dialogue between a captured German Panther crewman and his American guard. "Is it true," the American asks, "that one of your Panzers is worth 5 of our Shermans?" The German, with a smirk, replies, "Actually, one Panzer is worth 10 of your tanks." Puzzled, the American guard asks, "Then how did you lose the war?" "Because," the German answers with a sigh, "you always brought 11 tanks." This joke was more than just a punchline, it was a psychological coping mechanism. It was a frank admission of the Sherman's individual inferiority while simultaneously reaffirming faith in the Allied doctrine of overwhelming force. It acknowledged the fear and respect the Panther commanded, but it framed the ultimate outcome as an inevitability. "We may lose the duel," the joke implied, "but we will win the war." This sentiment became a cornerstone of the American tankers' morale. They knew they were in a lesser machine, but they also knew they were part of a much larger, and ultimately more powerful, industrial and military engine. The humor was a way of staring into the abyss of their own vulnerability and finding the strength to keep fighting, confident that another Sherman, and then another, would always be there to take their place and press the attack. The laughter had ceased, but a grim, unyielding determination had taken its root. Faced with the grim and often fatal calculus of their tank's technical inferiority, American crews quickly realized that conventional, head-on duels with Panthers were a recipe for disaster. Survival, and indeed victory, demanded a radical shift in thinking. If their shells couldn't punch through the Panther's front, they would have to find other ways to kill the beast. This necessity sparked a remarkable wave of battlefield innovation, where cunning, deception, and the leveraging of overwhelming combined arms support replaced the simple doctrine of tank versus tank combat. The Sherman crews, unable to win a fair fight, simply refused to engage in one. One of the most spectacular examples of this asymmetric thinking involved a Sherman battalion that found itself stalked by several Panthers near the Normandy coast. Recognizing the futility of a direct confrontation, the American commander devised a plan of audacious ingenuity. Instead of engaging the German tanks in the fields and hedgerows where the Panther's long-range gun and thick frontal armor gave it a supreme advantage, the Shermans turned and retreated, acting as bait. They deliberately lured the overconfident Panther crews towards the sea, drawing them into a seemingly perfect trap. The German commanders, likely sensing an easy victory against a fleeing enemy, pressed their advantage, pursuing the Shermans until they were exposed on the open shoreline. It was then that the trap was sprung. The American battalion had coordinated with the Royal Navy, and as the Panthers rolled into the prearranged kill zone, the colossal guns of the British battleship HMS Nelson, lying in wait offshore, opened fire. The shattering roar of 16-inch naval guns was followed by eruptions of sand and steel as high-explosive shells, each weighing more than a small car, slammed into the German tanks. The Panthers, designed to withstand anti-tank shells, were simply obliterated by the sheer concussive force and explosive power of naval artillery. It was a brutal lesson: the Americans might not have the better tank, but they had the bigger gun, even if it was floating several miles away. When outside support wasn't available, the solution had to come from within. The American military responded to the Panther panic by developing a specialized variant of the Sherman, the M4A3E2, universally nicknamed the Jumbo. This was not an attempt to outgun the Panther, but to outlast it. The Jumbo was a standard Sherman up-armored to an incredible degree, with thick steel plates welded onto the hull and a new, heavily reinforced turret, making its frontal protection even stronger than a Tiger II's. It was designed to lead assaults, absorb punishment that would destroy a normal Sherman, and draw enemy fire. The psychological effect of this fortress on tracks was perfectly illustrated in one memorable encounter. A German Panther commander ambushed what he thought was a standard Sherman and fired a direct hit, only to see the shell harmlessly bounce off. He fired again. And again. After his fifth armor-piercing round failed to have any effect, the German commander, in a fit of utter disbelief and exasperation, simply burst out laughing at the absurdity of the situation and surrendered his tank and crew. His ultimate weapon had been rendered impotent, not by a bigger gun, but by sheer, stubborn resilience. Beyond official modifications, individual crews developed their own brand of battlefield trickery, often blending practicality with a healthy dose of psychological warfare. The practice of piling sandbags on the hull and turret became widespread, though its actual effectiveness at stopping a high-velocity shell was dubious at best. Yet, it served another purpose: camouflage and confusion. This spirit of deception was immortalized in a legendary, though likely apocryphal, dialogue said to have occurred between a cleverly disguised Sherman and an inquisitive Panther. The story goes that a Sherman, so heavily laden with sandbags and foliage that it was barely recognizable, found itself face to face with a Panther. The German commander, peering through his sights, called out, "You wouldn't happen to be an American M4A3E8 Sherman tank?" From the pile of sandbags, a muffled American voice replied, "Goodness no, I couldn't even pronounce that." "Then what are you?" the confused German asked. "I think it's obvious," the American shot back. "I'm a pile of sandbags." Whether true or not, the tale perfectly captures the essence of the Sherman crew's new philosophy. They had learned to use their wits as a primary weapon, turning the battlefield into a stage for misdirection and guile. Laughter had returned to the Sherman crews, but it was no longer the naive humor of the overconfident. It was the sharp, cunning laughter of the underdog who had learned how to outsmart the bully. While tactical ingenuity and battlefield ruses provided the Sherman crews with a fighting chance, the brutal ledger of combat losses often told a different, grimmer story. Moving beyond individual encounters, the documented statistics of larger engagements reveal the stark reality of the Panther's superiority as a killing machine. In situations where cunning and surprise were on the German side, the scorecard could become horrifyingly lopsided. These bloody duels were not sporting contests, they were exercises in annihilation, and the Panther, when properly employed, was a master of the craft. Yet, these very statistics contain a hidden, crucial detail that helps explain why these tactical victories never translated into strategic success. The battlefields of France and the Ardennes were littered with examples of the Panther's devastating potential. An engagement near Saint-Sever-Calvados in August 1944 provided a textbook example of this lethal dynamic. Here, just two well-positioned Panthers managed to hold up and inflict serious damage on an entire column of advancing Shermans. Acting as a formidable defensive barrier, their powerful 75mm KWK-42 guns could pick off Allied tanks from ranges where the Sherman's return fire was utterly ineffective. The American advance was stalled, and the cost in men and machines was a stark reminder of the price of challenging a Panther on its own terms. This destructive capability reached its zenith during the desperate German offensives of the winter of 1944-45. During Operation Nordwind in January 1945, a small force of two elite SS Panthers demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of being caught by surprise. In a single, ferocious action, these two tanks tore through American lines, destroying a total of 9 Shermans. Even more astonishingly, they managed to capture 12 more M4s intact, their crews having bailed out or surrendered in the face of such overwhelming firepower. The psychological shock of such an event was immense. Similarly, in a battle near Heilsheim, 2 SS tankers displayed such lethal proficiency that they were both awarded the prestigious Knight's Cross for the incredible feat of destroying 21 American tanks. These were not isolated incidents but rather stark proof that, in a direct confrontation, the Panther was the undisputed king of the battlefield, capable of racking up kill counts that bordered on the unbelievable. However, Buried within this grim arithmetic of destruction lies a counter-statistic of profound importance, one that ultimately explains the Panther's failure to alter the course of the war. While a Sherman had a much higher chance of being knocked out in a duel, its crew had a significantly better chance of surviving the experience. A comprehensive post-war analysis revealed that American tankers and Shermans had a 3.5 times greater chance of escaping a disabled tank alive compared to their German counterparts in a Panther. This critical difference stemmed from several factors, including the Sherman's superior hatch design for quick egress, a lower tendency for its ammunition to detonate catastrophically compared to the Panther's often brittle hull, and better overall crew ergonomics. This fact fundamentally changed the equation of the war of attrition. When a Panther was destroyed, its highly trained, veteran crew was very often lost with it. The loss was absolute. A state-of-the-art machine and an irreplaceable five-man team were permanently removed from the German order of battle. Conversely, when a Sherman was knocked out, its crew frequently survived. Shaken but alive, these experienced men could be assigned a new tank, drawn from the vast American industrial reserve, and be back in the fight within days, their hard-won combat knowledge intact. The Germans were winning the duels but losing the war. Each destroyed Panther was a step towards defeat, while each surviving Sherman crew was a resource preserved to fight again. The bloody statistics showed that the Panther could kill tanks with terrifying efficiency, but the Allies' ability to save their crews proved to be the more decisive factor in a long, grinding war. In the crucible of war, where terror and adrenaline forge indelible memories, the line between fact and folklore often becomes blurred. The intense, life-or-death confrontations between American Shermans and German Panthers were particularly fertile ground for the growth of legends. In the decades following the war, stories told in veterans' halls, embellished in memoirs, and sensationalized in popular history have created a mythology around these steel behemoths. Sifting through this post-war narrative to separate documented reality from the powerful myths is crucial to understanding the true nature of the conflict. These legends, while not always factually accurate, often reveal a deeper truth about the psychology of the men who fought inside these machines. Perhaps the most famous and visceral confrontation involving a Panther is also the one that stands as a stark monument to factual, documented history. On March 6, 1945, amidst the ruins of Cologne, a dramatic and brutal duel unfolded near the city's iconic cathedral. A German Panther from Panzer Brigade 106 lay in ambush, and as an American Sherman from the 3rd Armored Division cautiously rounded a corner, the Panther's gun roared. The Sherman was hit, erupting in flames and smoke. The entire harrowing event was captured on film by an American combat cameraman, providing a chilling, second-by-second record of the Sherman's destruction. For a moment, the Panther was the undisputed king of the rubble-strewn street. However, the story did not end there. Alerted to the Panther's position, a newly arrived American M26 Pershing heavy tank was brought forward. In the subsequent engagement, the Pershing fired on the Panther, striking it and setting it ablaze. This encounter stands as a unique and invaluable historical record, often cited as the only fully documented tank-versus-tank duel of the war. Its significance lies in its brutal honesty. It validated the fear American crews had of the Panther, but it also demonstrated that the solution was not another Sherman, but a new, more powerful generation of American armor. While the Cologne duel is a matter of public record, many other tales belong firmly to the realm of urban legends, illustrating the immense psychological pressures of armored warfare. One of the most enduring myths, though centered on the Panther's larger cousin, the Tiger, perfectly captures the kind of folklore that emerged. The legend claims that Tiger crews suffered from a unique form of post-traumatic stress, not from combat, but from maintenance. The Tiger's complex, interleaved road wheels were notoriously difficult to repair, especially in the freezing mud of the Eastern Front, requiring hours of backbreaking labor. The myth alleges that the stress of this task, and the constant clanging of steel on steel, was so severe that the sound of plates and cutlery became a psychological trigger, making it impossible for the crews to eat from ceramic plates. This particular piece of folklore is often accompanied by a pointed, and likely apocryphal, story that highlights the intense inter-service rivalries within the German military. The tale goes that a high-ranking SS Standartenführer, seeking to mock the perceived hardships of the army's tank crews, deliberately provoked a fight between his tankers and a group of Luftwaffe pilots. He did this by sending a large stack of ceramic plates over to the tankers' table in the mess hall. This calculated insult, a direct jab at their supposed plate PTSD, was intended to belittle the ground pounders in front of the supposedly more glamorous airmen. The result, as the story goes, was an immediate and violent brawl. Whether based on a kernel of truth or entirely fabricated, these legends served a purpose. They were a way for soldiers to articulate the unique and often invisible stresses of their duties, transforming the grit, grime, and mechanical frustrations of their daily lives into a shared, legendary narrative of suffering and resilience. They were the human response to an inhuman reality, a mythology born from mud and steel. Beyond the cold analysis of armor thickness and muzzle velocity, the confrontation between the Sherman and the Panther was, at its core, a profoundly human drama. Inside every one of these steel beasts was a crew of young men, bound together by duty and terror, whose survival often hinged on a razor's edge of luck, a split-second decision, or the simple mechanics of an escape hatch. The technological conflict was fought by individuals, and their personal stories, often fragmented and harrowing, reveal the true cost of this armored warfare, stripping away the mythology to expose the flesh and blood within the machine. For the German crews of the Panther, their tank's technical superiority was a double-edged sword. It bestowed a sense of power and confidence, but it could not grant them invincibility. The line between life and death was often cruelly arbitrary. In one documented case, a Panther commander, needing a clear view of the battlefield, a vital necessity that the tank's limited periscopes could not provide, made the fateful decision to poke his head out of the turret hatch for a better look. In that fleeting moment of vulnerability, a stray piece of shrapnel or a sniper's bullet found its mark, killing him instantly. His crew, suddenly leaderless and blind, was left to fend for itself. His story was a common one, a testament to the fact that a tank, no matter how powerful, was only as safe as its most exposed crewman. In stark contrast is the story of another Panther commander named Germany, whose survival was owed not to skill or bravery, but to a simple oversight. During a chaotic engagement, his tank was struck and disabled. As flames began to fill the crew compartment, panic set in. Yet, Germany managed to escape the inferno. He survived for one simple reason: in the heat of the preceding battle, he had neglected to properly lock his commander's hatch. What would have been a breach of standard procedure in a training manual became his miraculous ticket to life. While his comrades may have perished inside the burning hulk, a moment of carelessness allowed him to be thrown clear by the force of an internal explosion, a random act of fate that spared him from the fiery tomb that his superior machine had become. To truly understand the human cost, one must imagine the final, terrifying seconds inside a stricken Panther, a scene that played out countless times across the battlefields of Europe. The world outside vanishes, replaced by a deafening, violent concussion as an Allied shell finds a weak point. The immediate aftermath is a sensory nightmare of darkness, the acrid smell of burning paint and cordite, and the sudden, searing heat of an internal fire. This is the moment where the machine dies and the human struggle for survival begins. Inside this steel coffin, chaos reigns. The gunner, his station now a tangle of burning wires, desperately claws his way towards an escape hatch, his path blocked by a wall of flame. He pushes through, his uniform igniting, driven by a primal instinct that overpowers the searing pain of his burns. In the driver's seat, the mechanic frantically attempts to restart the engine. The starter groans, a futile, dying sound in the roaring inferno. The tank is dead, immobile, a sitting duck. He knows it is hopeless. But his training, his last shred of hope, forces him to keep trying. And in the turret, the commander, perhaps wounded, perhaps simply stunned by the violence of the impact, has a moment of terrible clarity. He hears the screams of his crew, he feels the heat intensifying, and he understands with absolute certainty, this is the end. As this horrific internal drama reaches its climax, a new sound penetrates the chaos from the outside, the distinct, growing roar of multiple Sherman engines. The Americans are coming. They are not approaching to take prisoners, they are closing in to finish the job, to pump more shells into the crippled Panther until it is utterly consumed by fire. For the men trapped inside, this sound is the final, terrifying confirmation that their war is over. The appearance of the Panther on the battlefields of Normandy was more than just a tactical problem for the Allies, it was a profound technological shock that triggered a desperate and accelerated arms race. The initial confidence in the M4 Sherman, a tank designed as a versatile, mass-producible jack-of-all-trades, evaporated in the face of a specialized predator. The Panther's combination of mobility, sloped armor, and a high-velocity gun rendered the standard Allied tank obsolete in a head-to-head fight. This rude awakening forced American and British designers and strategists into a frantic scramble to counter the German threat, turning the final year of the war into a microcosm of technological one-upmanship, where battlefield lessons were immediately translated into engineering solutions. The most immediate and widespread Allied response was the upgunning of the Sherman itself. The introduction of the 76mm high-velocity gun was a direct and explicit answer to the Panther's formidable frontal armor. American ordnance recognized that the Sherman's original 75mm gun, while excellent for infantry support with its powerful high-explosive shell, simply lacked the kinetic energy to defeat Germany's new generation of armor. The 76mm gun, with its longer barrel and more powerful propellant charge, fired a smaller, denser projectile at a much higher speed. While it still struggled to reliably penetrate the Panther's glassy plate, it gave American crews a fighting chance. It could punch through the thick turret front at reasonable combat ranges and was more than capable of defeating the Panther's thinner side armor. The deployment of 76mm armed Shermans was a crucial stopgap measure, an evolutionary adaptation that allowed the existing, numerically superior M4 platform to remain relevant on a battlefield now dominated by a new class of opponent. While the Americans were developing their 76mm solution, the British had already deployed an even more potent Panther killer, the Sherman Firefly. In a brilliant piece of battlefield improvisation, British engineers managed to cram their formidable 17-pounder anti-tank gun into the cramped confines of a standard Sherman turret. The result was a hybrid tank that possessed the mobility and reliability of the American M4 but wielded a cannon that was arguably the best Allied anti-tank gun of the war. The 17-pounder could fire an armor-piercing, capped, ballistic-capped, APCBC, shell at such a high velocity that it could reliably penetrate the Panther's frontal armor from a distance of 900 meters. With specialized armor-piercing discarding sabot, APDS, rounds, its performance was even more devastating. The Firefly became the designated tank hunter in Commonwealth armored formations, and German Panther and Tiger crews quickly learned to identify and prioritize it in any engagement. Ultimately, however, modifying the Sherman was only a temporary solution. The Panther's success forced a fundamental re-evaluation of American tank design philosophy. The long-term answer was not to upgrade the M4, but to create a new machine purpose-built to beat the Panther at its own game. This effort culminated in the development and deployment of the M26 Pershing. The Pershing was, in every sense, an attempt to create an American equivalent to the Panther. It mounted a powerful 90mm gun that could finally match the German 75mm KWK-42. It featured thick, well-sloped armor for enhanced protection, and it utilized a modern torsion bar suspension system for better cross-country mobility. The late arrival of the Pershing to the European theater meant it saw limited combat, but its very existence was a direct consequence of the terror the Panther had instilled. It represented a paradigm shift in American armored doctrine, away from the concept of light, mobile medium tanks and towards a true heavy-hitting, main battle tank, capable of going toe-to-toe with the best Germany had to offer. The race that the Panther had started had finally been met. In the final accounting of the Second World War, the question of, who laughs last, is not answered in the fiery climax of a single tank duel, but in the cold, hard logic of industrial warfare. While the German Panther was, on a one-to-one basis, a technologically superior fighting machine that had brutally silenced the initial laughter of Sherman crews, it was ultimately a masterpiece of engineering that proved strategically irrelevant. The story of its confrontation with the M4 Sherman is a stark lesson that the best weapon does not always win the war. Germany may have won many of the individual battles, but America, with its vastly different approach to war, won the attrition-based campaign. The most decisive factor, and the one that rendered all other comparisons almost moot, was the staggering disparity in production numbers. For every one of the roughly 6,000 Panthers that Germany managed to build and field, the Allies produced nearly 8 M4 Shermans, with total production of the Sherman and its variants exceeding a colossal 49,000 units. This was not a fair fight, it was a tidal wave of steel. A destroyed Panther represented the loss of a precious, almost irreplaceable asset and its highly trained crew. A destroyed Sherman, while tragic for the men inside, was a statistically acceptable and easily replaceable loss for the Allied war machine. The American industrial behemoth could absorb losses at a rate that would have been catastrophic for the Germans, ensuring that for every Sherman a Panther killed, several more were always on their way to the front line. This war of numbers was compounded by a fundamental difference in design philosophy that had profound logistical consequences. The Panther was a complex, over-engineered thoroughbred, requiring specialized tools, extensive maintenance, and a well-established supply chain of spare parts. The Sherman, by contrast, was a workhorse. Designed for mass production and ease of maintenance, it was reliable, robust, and could often be repaired in the field using simple tools and interchangeable parts. This meant that on any given day, a higher percentage of American Shermans were operationally ready for combat compared to their German counterparts, which were frequently sidelined by mechanical failures. A Panther broken down behind the lines with a transmission failure was just as useless as one destroyed by enemy fire. Furthermore, the dramatic duels between tanks, while forming the core of armored warfare's legend, were not the deciding factor in the destruction of German armor. The Panther's true nemesis was not the Sherman, but the sky above. By 1944, the Allies had achieved almost total air supremacy over the battlefields of Europe. German tank columns were relentlessly hounded and decimated by swarms of American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Hawker Typhoons. These fighter bombers, armed with rockets, bombs, and heavy-caliber machine guns, could kill a Panther from an angle it could never defend against. The greatest threat to a German tanker was often not the tank in front of him, but the unseen Jagdbomber, or fighter bomber, lurking in the clouds. This overwhelming air power effectively negated much of the Panther's ground-level superiority, turning any daytime movement into a suicidal gamble. In the end, the Sherman crews did indeed stop laughing at the Panther. The initial derision born of ignorance was replaced by the cold sweat of fear, which eventually matured into a deep and abiding professional respect. They knew they were fighting a worthy, and often superior, opponent. But the final laugh belonged not to the crews and their turrets, but to the factory workers, the logisticians, and the pilots who supported them. The American crews had learned to respect the Panther not as an invincible monster to be feared, but as a dangerous adversary to be outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and, most importantly, outnumbered. The Panther was a tactical triumph that could not overcome a strategic catastrophe, a perfect predator that ultimately went extinct because it was simply overwhelmed by a more numerous and adaptable species.